Welcome to Not So Quiet on the Western Front, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the First World War. I'm Dan Hill, a military historian and battlefield guide specialising in the history of the war on the Western Front.
And I'm Dr. Spencer Jones, author and senior lecturer in war studies at the University of Wolverhampton. In this week's episode, we continue our exploration of perhaps the best-known battle of the First World War, the Battle of Verdun. From the initial German assault and descent into attritional warfare, this week we consider the latter stages of the battle, its overall impact, and what it meant for the wider war on the Western Front. Well, hello Dan, hello James. Pleasure to be joining you again as we continue our survey of the French army and more specifically continue our study of the Battle of Verdun, a pivotal battle on the Western Front, a pivotal battle in French and indeed German memory. And last week we really began our study of the battle about how and why it occurred and so forth. And Dan, I wonder if you could just recap for the listeners what we covered last week.
Hi Spence. Yeah, I think it's probably a really good place to start because, let's be fair, Verdun is a really complicated and confusing battle. Even though it takes place in a fairly defined area, there's so many different stages and sub-stages to it. It's worth considering just what the bigger picture is before we kind of move on to, if you like, the second half of the battle, albeit that it only takes place in the final, really the closing stages of the fight. Bear in mind, let's take it back to the geographical level. Verdun is in a pretty important location. It's an area that's been historically fought over quite a lot. It kind of represents, at least geographically, looks a little bit like Ypres. Verdun itself is a town on the Meuse River, down in fairly low ground. And to its north, northwest, and northeast, you have this kind of ring of hills that surround it. As a result of that, the French in the pre-war years have fortified that with dozens of forts and smaller forts in order to protect the approaches to Verdun along the Meuse. Now, the Germans have launched a huge attack starting back in February. Their plan is still debated, as we discussed last time. Are they trying to capture Verdun? Are they trying to knock the French out of the war? Certainly, they're trying to knock out the Verdun salient, which has formed around the town, and hopefully deal with a large psychological blow in the doing so. Later on, of course, as we know famously, there's this idea of bleeding the French army white, which is probably retrospective only. But that attack does get off to a good start, but importantly, it only gets off to a good start where it's launched, which is on the eastern bank. There's no attack at first on the western bank of the Meuse River. So that attack gains about 6 kilometers in the first 5 or so days, and it really starts to shake the French. The French are forced to react. They have to keep hold of Verdun, and so what they're going to do is throw men into the line and continue to do that really for the next 3 or so months, as they stop attack after attack, again on the east with the capture of Douaumont and Fort Vaux being besieged, and then later on when the attack starts on the west around Mortehomme and Hill 304, the French are going to start funneling men into this area at the same time that the Germans find themselves almost sleepwalking into a situation they really don't want to be in, which is getting into a long protracted fight in a situation where on the grander scale, Spence, they're already fighting a war they don't want to fight on 2 fronts. And I think that's a big point that we should really just kind of recap itself right now.
That's a very important point strategically because we actually ended an episode a few weeks ago about French and Allied plans at the end of 1915 that they're going to launch the general offensive, multiple attacks on all fronts at once. The West, the British and the French are going to attack, the Russians are going to attack in the East, the Italians are going to attack on the Alpine front. And that's the key strategic aim for the Western Allies. Well, they're not going to end this plan, even though the Germans have attacked first at Verdun. And the extent of German intelligence that they have that incoming Allied attacks are brewing for the summer is somewhat debated. Falkenhayn, the German commander, actually may even want the British to attack because, again, it may be a retrospective justification for Verdun, but something Falkenhayn is thinking about, and he certainly is considering this, is attacking very hard at Verdun. It's going to draw in lots of French troops. What will happen? Well, the British will be provoked into launching an attack to try and relieve the pressure, and Falkenhayn is quite contemptuous of what the British can do, so he thinks he might get 2 for 1, smash the French at Verdun, and draw in a British counterattack that will be wrecked on the barbed wire. But of course, he's underestimating the force that's going to be brought against the German Empire, really, in the summer of 1916, because the attack on the Somme, first day aside, is not going to play out how Falkenhayn wants it. There's going to be a massive Russian offensive in Ukraine in June, the so-called Brusilov offensive that's going to rip the heart out of the Austro-Hungarian army. And even the Italians, who of course have a ghastly war in the Alps, even they achieve some success. And so strategically, certainly as you approach the summer, Germany is under severe pressure on other fronts, and it's heavily embroiled in the Battle of Verdun. And we've discussed before, we don't really know exactly what the Germans wanted here. Was it a breakthrough? Is it an attempt to impose overwhelming attrition on the French? But I think it's worth reiterating, James, that what the Germans actually get is an extremely intense fight down at Verdun, because the French are just not going to budge an inch, and they're going to hit back.
Absolutely. And this is this phase where you get two key phrases that the French army is going to become known for during the First World War. In April, General Pétain gives this, "We will get them, on les aura," which is one of these first rallying cries. The second comes at arguably the darkest hour for the French at the Battle of Verdun, and that's in late May, early June. General Nivelle is a recent arrival to the battlefield. He's slowly but surely rising through the ranks, and he says the famous words, which we always associate with the French, many associate with Tolkien as well, which is "on ne passe pas," or "ils ne passeront pas," they shall not pass. And this is during this key moment where the Germans have taken heights on the west bank of the river, like Le Mortagne. They're going up the slopes of Hill 304. And then also on the east bank of the river, Douaumont, a counterattack to try to retake that, led by the 5th Division under a general named Charles Mangin. It fails, though Mangin claims he learns quite a bit of lessons that will pay off for him later in the war, as well as Fort Vaux, which is under siege. There's a officer named Raynal who's commanding the fort, a very interesting guy, comes from a socialist background, but is rising up in the military, is holding out surrounded at Fort Vaux. If you go to Fort Vaux today, you can just see the desperation of the French situation. They're communicating with the French lines after they're surrounded through semaphore mirrors, using a little bit of light signaling, as well as a pigeon. The last pigeon, whose name is Valiant, goes out of the fort early in June, and there's a monument to the pigeons of the Great War at the fort, just showing their importance to communications for the fort. So by early June, the French are very much at this low point. Key points of the battlefield have been lost. They are hoping for any sort of relief, and that will come further north on the Western Front. And Dan, can you speak a little bit to the meetings of the French High Command General Joffre, as well as Field Marshal Haig, as they open up the next offensive?
Well, I'm going to conveniently sidestep that one and pass it on to Spence, who's much better placed than I am. But before we do that, it's worth just, as you've rightly said there, talking about the fighting as it's gone up until this point. So by the time we start having conversations, of course, famously about the Somme and what exactly the French contribution is going to be there, we need to also acknowledge, I think, that down on the ground at Verdun at this point, we're entering, if you like, a kind of second stage or a 1.5 stage on what's really happened. In my mind, at least, you can really break down Verdun into kind of three segments. You've got the first initial German assault, which goes on for quite some time with subsequent assaults. Then you kind of have this attritional fight which develops, which is still does involve assaults, and certainly if you're on the ground, it doesn't feel like it's a quiet period. But in terms of big actions, it kind of is. It's before we get to the point when the French are then going to fight back later on in the battle. But it's just worth pointing out, I think, that the conditions here have descended into absolute carnage and chaos. We spoke about the famous Voie Sacrée last time out and the work to keep that open. Well, on the front line, if you can imagine the amount and the volume of fire that's gone in and utterly devastated the area, villages wiped off the map, trenches no longer even looking like trenches, a real true lunar moonscape for a number of people that are going to be out in the fighting. So both sides at this point are really struggling with the fight. And I think that kind of plays into this idea, Spence, because when it comes to the French deciding they're going to fight and they're going to take part in the fighting on the Somme, there's a real problem because they've tied up tons and tons and thousands of their troops in the fighting at Verdun who are pretty much exhausted. So not only have the French got to decide what contribution they're going to make to a fight further north, but what troops are they going to use to do it? And do they weaken the Verdun salient in order to make that happen? That's the big question in these conversations.
It is, and it puts the British Army under additional stresses and strains as well, because the offensive on the Somme, and we discussed this in a much earlier episode. The offensive on the Somme has always been seen in Britain as being really a French-led offensive with British support, because the British army is very inexperienced. It's not well trained in 1916. There's still problems with equipment. And to ask it to be the spearhead in this massive offensive is asking an awful lot of some very brave and determined, but also poorly trained and inexperienced troops. And if you can instead have a cutting edge of elite French divisions, it's probably going to work better. But of course, the French gradually, and then more rapidly as the Battle of Verdun increases in tempo and intensity, move troops out until really there's only going to be a relatively small French contribution on the southern end of the battlefield, and it's going to be a British battle through and through. One of the interesting things, though, is that Douglas Haig is sort of caught a little bit on the horns of a dilemma, because on one hand, he's not a complete idiot, and he recognises that this is going to ask a lot of his inexperienced army. But on the other hand, as I've discussed elsewhere, Haig is fundamentally an optimist, and he compounds all these pieces of good news, and he looks at the situation and says, well, the Germans are knee-deep in Verdun, and they're involved in intense fighting. The Russians begin their offensive in June 1916 and inflict a lot of damage on the Austro-Hungarians. German divisions are going to have to go east. He thinks that the Germans are actually in a very weak position, which in a way, the Germans are strategically now starting to get stretched by the early summer. And Falkenhayn finds himself in a difficult position. We've mentioned previously that Falkenhayn is a very cold fish. He's the only German commander on the Western Front, a senior commander on the Western Front, who doesn't have a nervous breakdown. Von Moltke has a nervous breakdown. Erich Ludendorff has a nervous breakdown. Falkenhayn doesn't, which I think tells you something about his mental resolve. But in the summer of 1916, he is under extreme pressure. Pressure from the Allies, pressure internally too. I have to share a story here that's probably apocryphal, but the very fact, well, it is apocryphal, but the very fact it passes around the corridors of power in Berlin and Vienna, I think shows the pressure Falkenhayn's under. And this is when the Russians crash into the Austro-Hungarians in the summer of 1916 and the Brusilov offensive inflict massive damage on the Austro-Hungarian army that it never really recovers from. And Falkenhayn's furious because he thinks he's got an agreement with Konrad von Hotzendorf, who commands the Austro-Hungarians, that they're going to hold strongly on the Eastern Front. But von Hotzendorf has just completely ignored that, and he sent his best divisions down to fight the Italians instead. And now the Ukraine front is collapsing. Falkenhayn's got to deploy emergency divisions out there, and there's a meeting apparently between the two of them in Berlin, where Falkenhayn, who's a cold, calculated operator, apparently he slaps the table and jumps out of his chair. He's so enraged with what Hotzendorf has done by stripping the Eastern Front of troops. And according to some accounts, although these are almost certainly apocryphal, he even grabs Hotzendorf by the lapels and shakes him and yells in his face. That probably doesn't happen, but the slapping of the table and jumping out of the chair, quite possible, because he's under huge pressure about this. The problem is, what does he do now? And James, I think one of the interesting aspects of Verdun is Falkenhayn's in this double or quits position. If he breaks off the battle now at Verdun, in a way he has to admit defeat. He's captured a bit of ground, he's created a moonscape, but he's not captured his overall objectives. Calling off the offensive now looks like admitting defeat. He doesn't want to break it off, but what options does he have to continue the battle on the Verdun front?
The Germans are constantly trying to poke at the flanks of the French army, and the overall objective in getting into the town of Verdun is highlighted for them as you get into May and June on the left bank of the river. As we said, Le Mortagne, Hill 304 has fallen, but they're also making slow gains in the center. Fort Vaux, after a 7-day siege, falls in early June. And they're slowly but surely inching their way towards Fleury, which is this small town, obliterated now. You can go see where it was. We talked a bit about it last week. And slowly but surely working their way down the hills towards Verdun. And it's not going to be until the middle of July when they come up against Fort Souville that the final German offensives are sort of stagnating. And the French kind of look at this as the high water mark of the German offensives around Verdun, and that's this attack at Souville. But for the French army and the French soldiers, the experience, even during all these months of being worn down, slowly being pushed back, is one that becomes the paramount experience of the French army in the Great War. And that's something we said last week. It's something that I think we should bring back up and highlight a little bit again. I've got the regimental history of the 18th Infantry Regiment, which is another one of these units that sees lots of action in the war. After General Montchamps failed counter-assault on Fort Douaumont on May 22nd, again, we're getting these dark hours of the French army. They're one of the units that is pulled up into the line to replace the soldiers of 4 regiments who have suffered 5,600 casualties. So about getting close to half the division is lost, and they're in immediate need of support. They go into the area around Fleury and Douaumont. In fact, the line they hold is at the base of the southern end of where the cemetery is now. It's at a post called Abri, or Dugout 320. There are just some fascinating accounts of coming into this area. The regimental history talks about coming up after traversing Fleury devant Douaumont. The regiment was placed in line about 1 a.m. in the morning in shell holes because there was no trace of the communication trenches or the trenches themselves. Many units didn't find those who they were to relieve. A captain, sole survivor of a machine gun company, identified the positions. One of the battalions coming up stumbles upon Germans and has to push them out of the French frontline trenches, or what they believe the French frontline trenches are. The 18th experience at Verdun is sitting in these shell holes for about 3 days and suffering about 50 to 60% casualties. That's their whole experience of the Battle of Verdun. And for many French units, that is the experience. Again, we talked about tenir, to hold. That is what these guys are doing. And although they're not doing these grand cinematic and horrifying over-the-top assaults, for the French, this is what they need to do, just hold on. As you highlighted, the Germans are almost wearing themselves down, debating what are the true objectives of this attack. Can we achieve the objectives of this attack? And I think it's a lesson that we could take from the First World War, and it doesn't matter what business you're in, what field you work in. If you start on a project, whether you work in a chippy or an insurance bank, you got to know what the objectives of the project are to know if you finished. And for the German army, they have not figured that out.
That's a really good point, and well said. I might add as well, I like the chippy reference there. So, when we really get to this point now, and as you said, this idea of the French army really only holding up until this point, you could argue that that's all they need to do. I would further argue, perhaps, if you were to ask the Allies, what would you like the French to do in the middle part of 1916, before the fighting took place? Quite high on that list is, well, we'd quite like them to get themselves embroiled in a fight somewhere and tie down loads of their own units. Well, rather conveniently, by this time in the Battle for Verdun, they've done it of their own accord. And actually, it does provide opportunities elsewhere. And whilst, of course, the Battle of the Somme, which is going to be the subject of a future podcast from the French perspective, does play a big part in that. It forces the Germans to react and so on and so forth. Actually, the Germans are kind of really sewing up their own problems here in the Verdun front. What it does, though, once the Germans utterly exhausted themselves in this absolutely horrific landscape, and I'm reminded, actually, if any of our listeners here ever look at the US National Archives, NARA, which are fascinating in terms of understanding the history of warfare, all of the material is available free there, it's all been kept. There are some incredible videos and newsreels shot of the Verdun front. And I'm just reminded of one that every time I watch it, it's just kind of mesmerizing. What it is, it's a French newsreel team somewhere just behind the front lines of Verdun. They found one French soldier stuck waist deep in the mud. I don't know if either of you guys have seen this before. And this camera just points at this one poilu for about 2 minutes as he tries to drag leg out, move forward a few yards, drag his leg out, move forward, drag another leg forward, and he's slowly, very slowly, utterly exhausted, creeping his way to a bit of duckboard that's running ahead. And there are people walking past within 5 or 6 feet of him, and they just keep going. And this camera crew have clearly, I hope they go and get him after they stop filming, by the way, but this camera crew has just been focusing on this one utterly exhausted and totally dejected poilu. Now, that's such a powerful piece of film, and maybe we can get a link at the end of this episode. But I think it also sums up that middle phase of the fighting, where things have just turned into absolute carnage. And James, what you mentioned with people thinking that they've arrived in their own trench only to find that either they've overrun the trench or the trench they're looking for simply doesn't exist anymore. This kind of confusion in this wilderness of shell holes is really, I think, quite emblematic of that entire fight. But things are going to change because the French, once they realise just how exhausted the Germans are and the fact that there's a possibility to push back, we're going to start to see, Spence, the build-up, if you like, for another fight, which is going to see the second half of the Battle of Verdun, albeit it's not going to take place till October. But we're going to also start seeing some interesting inventions, and I know you're a big one for artillery. In terms of the idea here of getting the enemy to unmask their batteries, it's quite a clever, quite a novel new concept. And what are the ramifications for that on the ground?
This is interesting because the French are, in some ways, at the cutting edge. The British are running roughly similar, and there's some debate about who actually comes up with this first. But the French are at the cutting edge of what's called sound ranging. And sound ranging is the concept of you detect a German gun firing, and then you can triangulate where that gun is fired from, and then you can deliver very rapid counter-battery fire upon it. And the French can get that counter-battery fire down to within about 60 seconds. Now, sound ranging is a really advanced science, and of course, it's based on seeding the area with microphones. They pick up the sound, you then triangulate it centrally, and with a skilled operator, you can quickly calculate where that sound's come from. It's quite remarkable when you consider this is all done with analog on a very confusing, intense battlefield that is noisy, and these microphones have to be able to distinguish, for example, a German field gun opening up with just a German mortar, for example, and so on and so forth. But the Germans don't have this in 1916, the French do. And the French also are adding to this an older science of artillery spotting called flash spotting, whereby you have observers connected to telephones who are looking specifically for the flash of a gun as it opens up. It's a quick movement, but if you have a German battery start firing, that you will get multiple flashes. And then triangulate the flash based on a variety of observation instruments. Advanced stuff. The Germans also use flash ranging, but the French are better at it, and the French have sound ranging in a way the Germans don't. And what the Germans start to find is that their ability to carry out the really crushing bombardments, and if you remember, listeners, last week we talked about how the opening bombardment really catches the French by surprise and is overwhelming initially in its force. The Germans aren't able to do this anymore. The German artillery is now in a distinct, hard fight, and that they are getting hit with a lot of counter-battery fire. The French are getting very good at getting rounds onto German batteries very quickly. So what do the Germans do? Well, they have to try and distribute their guns instead. They have to try and disperse their guns, which is, it's disadvantageous. It's harder to actually coordinate your fires. It's harder to get concentration. And of course, it imposes a toll on being a German gunner. You're always a bit worried. The moment you open up, you're going to be hit by counter-battery fire. You're going to be exposed to a storm of shrapnel. And interestingly enough, the German artillery isn't entirely sure why the French have got so good at this. They don't really pick up on the sound ranging concept in 1916. They think it might be aerially directed. And the French are certainly doing this. They are using reconnaissance aircraft to guide gunfire, as the Germans are. And actually you get some grumbling amongst the German artillery that, well, where's our Air Force? Why isn't our Air Force covering us? This is why we're taking all this counter-battery fire. And if you remember, listeners, that Falkenhayn had in some ways conceived this entire offensive as an artillery-driven offensive where he'd massed over 1,000 guns with an element of surprise. Well, now the artillery battle it's not one-sided. The French are also taking counter-battery, but it is inclining towards the French. They're starting to get an upper hand in this. And in a battlefront like Verdun, which is moonscaped, which is muddy, which is now being fought over small tactical points, the bigger strategic vision of Verdun, I think, is evaporating by the summer. This artillery battle is really definitive, and the shell fire, the gunfire is constant, and the French rotation's important here as well, because when the French rotate, they also can rotate batteries. The Germans try and rotate batteries, but remember, listeners, they're being drawn into lots of other fights. The Somme, troops to the east, and it's starting to put a lot of pressure onto the Germans. Well, how do we keep our gun batteries going? Barrels need replacing and so forth. And you start to see in 1916 amongst the German artillery quite a lot of use of captured weapons. So captured Russian guns, captured Belgian artillery, and that poses problems too. The Germans aren't being decisively defeated in the artillery battle, but they're under a kind of pressure that they've never been under before on the Western Front, and that's going to be pivotal as the Battle of Verdun continues.
And this is a point I just want to add where you see the French artillery coming up with new ideas, trying out new themes. You mentioned, the sound ranging. They're bringing forward different organizations. They're separating divisional artillery from the infantry of the division to create these massive fire groups, groupements, that are going to define the French bombardments rolling forward. Of course, when we get into the fall and the counteroffensives, you'll see some of that too. They're also beginning to create new formations in the air service. The Germans, as you mentioned, are complaining about the loss of air cover, and this is because the French Air Force is organizing and bringing forward its core strength with the idea that they need to control the airspace over the Verdun battlefield. This is where you see a lot of the famous French aces of the war. There's very much a focus on just make sure you don't see a single German plane in the sky. For English-speaking listeners, this is also the point where the famous Lafayette Escadrille enters the battle, the American volunteer pilots who fly over the battlefield of Verdun. And all of these thoughts are coming together into what will be referred to as the Verdun School by historians later on. It is keenly associated with generals like Nivelle, who is going to organize the counteroffensives that are going to retake points of the line into the fall. So the French army is redefining itself after these experiences of April, trying how to figure out just how to hold and come out on top of the Germans, kind of wear them down more than they're wearing you down, and then take advantage of their weaknesses.
Yeah, very much so. And I think before we kind of get to that exact point with taking advantage of weaknesses, the weakness by now being simply exhaustion on the German side, and as we've said, problems with artillery, problems with supply generally. What we should also remember here is that the French have been learning, albeit as with everything in the Great War, very costly lessons, but they're starting to figure out how best to fight. And particularly, they've been learning from what they've seen the Germans do well in the early days of the offensive. So we're going to start to see new artillery methods brought in. We're going to start to see small unit tactical advances, as well as things like increasing the number of light machine guns available in an offensive. So, as we've heard many times, to gain ground in the Great War isn't impossible. To hold it against the inevitable counterattack is very difficult, and particularly when you bring in some of the other factors. Remember, we're talking middle of 1916. When the Germans start the fight, the weather's not that great, but it's not terrible. Middle of June, July, right through those months, we're only 50 miles away from the Somme. 1st of July 1916, famously for the British, very warm. It's about 29 degrees. Ground's quite decent. It's not really been that badly churned up. Well, Verdun has been churned up, but it's not been soaking wet. But by the time we get to September and October, the taps have turned on. It starts to get wet. The ground starts to get clogged up. Certain areas are basically going to be impassable just because of the weather, let alone what the enemy are up to. And so for that reason, amongst others, when the French start looking, they consider first of all the idea of a large-scale counterattack across the entire Verdun salient to really force the Germans back on all fronts. Actually, James, they decide to be a little more modest with what they're aiming to do, and they're really going to target their offensives when we get to October into several specific locations.
Yeah, they're going to go for these key points that are defining the Verdun battlefield. These are those forts up on the heights. Again, we'll keep on coming back to them because that's where the important parts of the battlefield are. That's that high ground. It's no wonder the French built forts on these key parts. So one of the main offensives will be the retaking of Dugout, which is going to be assaulted by what they refer to as a colonial division. In reality, these are primarily French Marines as well as North African tirailleurs, as well as Zouaves, who are retaking the position of Dugout. They're following that formula that will become the key to victory on the Western Front, which is very closely following behind a rolling barrage, getting into the German lines before the Germans can recuperate. They're also going to be using coordination with air, this new small unit inventions with light machine guns, rifle grenades. the retaking of Fort Douaumont is going to rapidly raise morale in the French army and in the French nation. General Nivelle is promoted as this hero of Verdun. He is able to take these experiences he's gained as a corps and army group commander and say, I found it. I've got the key to victory. You guys should give me the keys to the car. And we'll get into that in 1917. But for the French, retaking Vaux, retaking Douaumont, retaking Le Morton, retaking Hill 304, gives them this domination of the battlefield that the Germans are slowly but surely pushed further back from the spires that they had seen over the town of Verdun in the midsummer. And the French even get back to the original Bois de Caux of early February, where the initial assault had started and the chasseurs of Driant had held out. So the battlefield returns to French control as they make these small counterattacks, generally on a divisional level, sometimes on a corps level, nibbling away at the German positions as French forces are rotated in, rotated out. Some are now not only veterans of Verdun, but veterans of the Somme and returning to Verdun for their second or even third tour at the battlefield and gaining complete superiority. By the end of the year, the French are going to take all these lessons they've gained from the Battle of Verdun and organize themselves into what they think will be this breakthrough assault. So, as Spencer pointed out, you've got these kind of key themes or key sections of the Battle of Verdun. The first section, which is the surprise, the German attack. The second section, which is hold on. And the third section, which is counterattack. Take this ground back. And the third section for the French, although long and drawn out through the fall into the early winter, the Battle of Verdun is given an end date in December of 1916, though, as we all know, the Western Front is never quiet, even in a quiet sector. But this third stage of the assault, where they actually see success in the assault, taking their objectives, taking thousands of German prisoners. There's, as you mentioned in this newsreel footage, there's a great series of videos taken during the French assaults of the fall of 1916. And in one, you see a battalion of French infantry jumping off towards the retaking of Fort Douaumont. And then the next shot is just a line of hundreds of German prisoners coming back. So the Germans in this area, who have been here for quite some time, are also being demoralized. The Verdun for them, again, is this mill on the Meuse. Both sides are losing so many lives. It has become a symbol not only of French resistance, but of the brutality of warfare on the Western Front.
I think, Spence, there's a really key point that we can bring out here in what James has said. And it comes down to this idea of the third phase around Verdun. You could possibly argue, that if the battle came to an end, say, with that holding action and the French didn't push the Germans back, is there an argument, albeit a tenuous one in German circles, to say, well, look, we were still victorious at the Battle of Verdun. We'd still gained ground. We'd still managed to really put pressure on the French at Verdun. Yes, we had inflicted terrible attrition on them. But once the French push back and the Germans lose the bulk of the terrain they've captured, their troops are utterly exhausted. They lose men as POWs, which appears in the newsreels and various things like that. At this point, have we now taken away any semblance of the Germans being able to say, well, Verdun was a victory?
Really good question, and gives me an opportunity to just put this Verdun in a wider strategic context, because we were discussing just a few minutes ago about the strategic surroundings of this. The Allies are still going to launch the general offensive, and Falkenhayn is knee-deep in Verdun. Intelligence telling him the offensive is coming. The Russians are attacking. The British are going to attack. What do? Well, of course, they keep pressing on. They launched their last really big offensive on the Eastern Heights in July. The British attack, of course, alongside the French on the Somme in July, continue to hammer away at the Germans. The Russians make big advances in the east. Everything's falling apart, and Falkenhayn is under excruciating pressure here, and he gets replaced. He's sacked as Supreme Commander in the West, although he'll continue to serve. Gets replaced by Hindenburg and Ludendorff, so Hindenburg in overall command, Ludendorff commanding on the Western Front. And they come out and they take a look at the Western Front and say, this is a pretty disastrous situation. The Allies are attacking us with masses of machinery. And one thing they immediately do is they say, no more offensives at Verdun. We're shutting this down. It's not a battle that they've wanted. It's not a battle that they've really supported Falkenhayn going through with. And they shut it down and say, right, we're going to try and fight defensively. But the Germans are under excruciating pressure across all the fronts. Certainly by September 1916, they're under really heavy pressure on the Somme. They're under heavy pressure still in the east. The Russians still hammering away, although the line's stabilizing. Romania enters the war, although it gets smashed very quickly, unfortunately, for the Allies and for Romania as well. The Italians still hammering away in the Alps, and so they're under all this pressure. And on top of this, they've had the naval battle of Jutland in May and into very early June in 1916. That hasn't really gone as well as the Germans hoped. So the Germans are under enormous pressure on all fronts. Where can they actually claim a victory? Well, the one place they can possibly claim some strategic success is at Verdun and say, listen, we captured a lot of territory, we've inflicted a lot of damage upon the French. You can't really claim the Somme as a German victory, though they try to. They've clearly taken heavy casualties and had to give ground. You can't claim the fighting in the east as a victory. There's been a lot of ground lost there. Verdun's the one sort of hope, really, the Germans can claim for a major victory. And the French counteroffensive in October rips that away, and it's going to really emphasize to the German high command, you've lost. Strategically, you've lost 1916. The only bright spark for the Germans is conquering Romania, which does have profound strategic benefits for Germany. But on the Western Front, it's been a horrible year. Although the line's held at the Somme, it's only held just, and there's an anticipation there's going to be more attacks. And everything that's been thrown at Verdun ultimately has failed. The Germans have been thrown back there. And Verdun will be a hugely controversial battle in post-war Germany. Falkenhayn will take brickbats throughout the 1920s for launching this offensive. What was he thinking? And that's, of course, what leads him to later try and justify it as it was designed to be an attritional battle. That was always the plan. And look, that's what we got, because we did inflict more casualties on the French than we received in return. And that is not considered a convincing justification in the 20s or 30s. Probably not a convincing justification now. And I think, James, another thing is, if the Germans ultimately have to accept Verdun as a defeat, for the French, this is almost a moment of national catharsis at the end of 1916, that the Battle of Verdun, the tide has been turned.
That is the feeling for many, many people. You'd seen this horrible devastation, these losses at the Verdun battlefield, but there's a feeling that the French army has learned from this. And it can be reflected in some numbers. Just to give you overarching ideas, French casualties in 1916, although we associate this with these moonscape battlefields, as we talked about last week, are not as large as 1915. They're able to identify this methodical battle strategy on the Somme, which we'll get to, with these integration of arms at Verdun. They feel like they've gained tactical lessons that will be able to bring them through. Just 2 months of casualty figures at Verdun are larger than the British casualties on the single day, the 1st of July, 1916. So while Verdun is a much longer battle, it is concentrated points of destruction, and the French suffer these casualties at these points. A lot of that time spent at Verdun is simply holding on, and there's a feeling that they have held on. The Poilus have held the front lines. They have been able to sustain these horrifying German bombardments. They've been able to create bombardments of their own and take back these key points. Much like in Germany, there is jubilation at the fall of Douaumont in February and March of 1916. In France, there's jubilation at its retaking, even though by this point it's a ruined, destroyed fort that's of no use other than as an observation post on high ground. They are noticing the Germans are beginning to change their defensive tactics to become a much more elastic defense. They also feel as though they found their new heroes in General Nivelle, that these generals which will lead them to victory. They are an experienced army that they prove can beat the Germans, can take ground. New technologies like new fighter aircraft, a Colonel Estienne who has witnessed the grouping of his artillery and the power of artillery is going to argue for the creation of a new branch of assault artillery, which will be formed in the fall of 1916. In the English-speaking world, will probably refer to them as the tanks. They will be making their appearance in 1917 based on the lessons of Verdun. General Joffre in writing a note on the lessons, wrote in giant capital letters that not an inch of ground was surrendered voluntarily. The moral factor of battle is still preponderant. While the Germans had assaulted, the French had held, they had also been able to hold their nerves in the face of the German assault. And there was a feeling that with the replacement of Falkenhayn by Hindenburg and Ludendorff, that the French and their commanders had outlasted the Germans' ability to hold on. Though by the end of 1916, with both of the major battles on the Western Front, over 500,000 casualties in these two battles. They're going to go to a 3-regiment of infantry structure in their infantry divisions versus 4 regiments. The British are going to do this later in the war due to the fact that they cannot keep up with the manpower needs. So slowly but surely, the French are going to adapt to these tactics, but they're going to leave 1916 with a feeling of slight satisfaction of, we've held on, but oh man, was this experience horrible. What they'll see as they enter 1917 is these leaders of the Battle of Verdun, like Nivelle, saying, hey guys, we figured it out. We're going to get them this spring. Once we get to 1917, we'll see what actually happens. But the combination of lessons of Verdun and then the Somme, which we'll be talking about in our next episode, are going to come together to feel to the French like we've proven to our enemy, we've proven to our allies, we are the predominant force, and we're going to win this war.
It's a really interesting point about how the French do come out of this, despite the incredible human cost of Verdun, feeling as if this has been a victory. And a defining victory. And I'm reminded of a French postcard, which I'll actually have. It's regular listeners know I collect First World War postcards. That's issued in December 1916, and it's got a French soldier, and he's holding a victory laurel. And he's looking out, and written around, he's looking very determined. He's got a rifle in the other hand, laurel in one. And written around the laurel are a variety of French victories. And the most prominent of this, so there's the Marne, there's the Somme, and there's Verdun. And he's sort of looking out, and it's the caption or the headline is from 1916 to victory in 1917, and probably a New Year's card or something. So it's seen in that sense as this is the moment. And I think there's a sense that the Germans have shot their bolt. The Allies know that the Germans have taken a terrific pounding in 1916, which they have. The Germans make the very first peace overtures, although they're very, very dubious in what they want and what they expect. There's largely German fantasy about what they're going to get at this stage. But the Germans have strategically taken a huge blow, and I think it's interesting that the French, and the British for that matter, enter 1917 saying, well, 16's been really bloody, but we've learnt a lot of really important lessons. In 17, we're going to get the Germans good and proper. Whereas the Germans come out of this and go, what a nightmare. We can't afford that again. We need to change our defensive methods to avoid. They call it Somme fighting, but you could also call it Verdun fighting. And I think in the German High Command, more so than the Somme, Verdun is seen as this really disastrous period. I think the moment that Fort Vaux is voluntarily given up by the Germans on the 3rd of November is a really heavy psychological blow. You fought so hard for this devastated area, and then you surrender it without a fight, and the French recapture nearly all the ground they'd lost. So German High Command is left shocked, and there's a lot of soul-searching within the German military, and it's worth reflecting, I think, Dan, why do you think this battle goes so horribly wrong for the Germans?
Well, it's an interesting question, and I think one of the reasons, just going back to what you mentioned for a second there, that Verdun stings so badly for the Germans, is that it's a battle of their choosing. It's one thing to get a kicking on the Somme, everybody gets a kicking on the Somme, but they didn't choose to fight that battle, they're reacting to an enemy offensive. The same thing you could argue about 1917 if it goes differently. The Somme is something the Germans choose to initiate. The Somme is something that the Germans could have stopped really at any point after that first week, at least up until the autumn, and probably not had to suffer anything like what they did. But it ends up drawing in more and more troops, even with major commanders as early as May saying, look, we're not going to win this fight. It almost becomes a sore point, more so for the Germans than it does for the French. It's an unusual action, I think, unusual battle in that sense. I mean, it's extraordinarily long as well, and we shouldn't forget that. 300 days of fighting. That's a very, very long, continuous slog for everybody involved, and it churns up all manner of material and supplies, and we can maybe finish off this episode by asking what the prospects for the Germans looked like in 1917, because you can be pretty damn sure that by the end of 1916, the Germans are asking themselves that very question. So, as we come to rounding up the Battle of Verdun, what does it represent in that big picture? Well, I think on one level, you have to just bring it back to the real human aspect, and something that maybe we're apt to overlook sometimes when looking at these very big actions from a fairly distant lens of a century later. French losses, a little bit over 1/3 in that fight, 1/3 men. German losses, a little bit under 1/3. So, it proves a lie with this idea of bleeding the French army white. Well, if the French army ends this battle white, the Germans are pretty damn pasty as well. They're only slightly less worse off. From that point of view, you can't really say that this idea of an attritional fight, and bear in mind, the French have got a lot of staying power if you add their Western allies into it as well. Could that ever be argued as really being the reason for the fight? I don't think so. I think the Germans get themselves involved in a fight that they think will be fairly straightforward. By the time they realise where they are, it's already too late. They're far too invested in the fight. They totally underestimate French resolve. And this is a classic, I think, for all major failures in military history. Underestimating your enemy's resolve has got to be right at the very top of the list of things that people do wrong. They just do not understand that the French, and they should do by now, because they've seen French fighting resolve before now. This isn't the first time they've come up against a determined French enemy, and certainly won't be the last. They should have known that the French were going to fight. They don't. They come up with an idea, and as soon as it starts to go wrong, rather than back out and say, well, hang on a minute, they double down and hope that they're going to get the right result. And I think if we were going to truly argue, James, the one thing that the Germans didn't want to get was really the battle they end up getting in 1916.
The battles of 1916 are ones that, as we've just said, are ones the Germans set out to fight, at least at Verdun, and they aren't expecting the outcome. On the Allied side and the French side, you also see this slow but sure change in the French soldier, the French army, as they've been able to hold on, but there's still not a clear end to the war in sight. Verdun, and as we'll get to, the Somme, don't portray themselves to the public, to the soldiers, as these victories that will lead to the end of the war. They feel as though they might have had some experiences that can add to that, but there's truly no end in sight. And for my part, I feel as though ending on this note from a soldier named Louis Meret, who is a soldier in the 127th Infantry, he thought that the soldier of 1916 doesn't fight for Alsace or to destroy Germany or for his country. He fights out of honesty, habit, and duty. He fights because he has no alternative. He continues to fight because after the initial burst of enthusiasm and the despair of the first winter, the second brought acceptance. What we hoped would only be temporary has become a situation stable only in its instability. We have swapped our homes for a dugout, our families for our fellow soldiers. We now cut out our lives from the cloth of sorrow rather than well-being. We have tailored our feelings to the daily grind and found our balance in imbalance. We no longer believe this will ever change. We no longer see ourselves going home. We carry on hoping it will happen, but we're not counting on it. And I should note that Meret was killed in the spring of 1917 in the fighting on the Chemin des Dames.
Powerful stuff. And of course, that will be 2 episodes from now, our destination, where we'll find out whether Nivelle's great strategic plan, the lessons that he's learned at Verdun, whether he can put them to good use on the Chemin des Dames. Spoiler alert, you just heard a little bit of the answer in that very powerful quote we just heard. I wonder, Spence, in terms of kind of summing up Verdun, would it be fair to maybe instead of summing up the battle, look at it from the perspective of the German army and say, what are their prospects for 1917? Not the end of the Battle of Verdun. What are their future prospects like following Verdun? Because that maybe gives you a little clue about the true cost of the battle from their point of view.
Well, from really late 16 onwards, when the German High Command sits down and says, well, what can we do? It's been a really bad year for the German High Command, and they need a solution. And the answer is absolutely bleak. there's no prospect of victory on the Western Front, and they expect more heavy British and French offensives that are going to be spearheaded by more and more machines. Tanks, artillery, more and more aircraft. The British and the French have put the Germans into the Materialschlacht, the battle of material, and Germany can't really win that in its current state. So the Western Front is going to have voluntary withdrawals for the first time since 1914. They're going to have to dig in. On the Eastern Front, there doesn't seem a lot of prospect of victory there either. There's nothing really within striking distance for the Germans. They might launch offensives here against the Russians, but where do you aim them? There's no obvious target, at least at the start of 1917. And strategically, Germany is groaning underneath the British economic blockade. And it's actually all these combinations that prompt the Germans in December 1916 to say, the army can't win. We can hold on, but we can't win. Well, we need to turn to the Navy, and that's going to lead to the U-boat offensive, the renewed U-boat offensive, the unrestricted offensive, where all neutral shipping, any shipping in British waters is liable for immediate sinking without warning, even though the Germans know that will bring the United States into the war. And that's considered a risk worth taking, because Germany's options here are do nothing and just get pounded on both the Eastern and the Western Front, and indeed the Italian front, and eventually the system is going to crack, or gamble and try and do something that might win the war. But if it doesn't win the war, well, guess what? You've just brought the most powerful neutral into the world on the side of the Allies. And that Germany feels it has to take that decision, I think, is testament to what a very difficult year the German army has had at the end of 1916. And we've commented before about 1915 is probably the best year for the Central Powers. They're victorious on just about all fronts, especially the German army. A year later, in 1916, the Germans they're not broken. They're going to fight very hard for the next 2 years, but they've had the strategic initiative torn away from them. And militarily on land, the Germans can't necessarily see a way out. And perhaps that's the big experience of 1916 for the Germans. But just to hint towards what James has already mentioned about what's coming in 1917, one of the tragedies in a way for the Allied cause is on a military level, they think, well, this has been a good year for us. And in pure military terms, it has. Politically, the governments of Britain and France, they're not so sure. They're not happy with these casualty bills and so forth. And it gives rise to a set of plans in 1917 that are going to push the French army almost to its breaking point. And this, I suppose, is the nature of war. The advantages won and lost. And that moral aspect that you mentioned, James, is so critical in war. Even in a war like the First World War, with casualties in the millions, masses of firepower and machinery, human willpower is still a crucial factor in battle.
And with that, it brings us to the end of today's and our look at the Battle of Verdun. Hope you found it interesting. I certainly have. James's knowledge is outstanding on this subject, so a learning curve for both Spence and I as we go through. Of course, next time we're going to be shifting northwards and back in time a little bit to 1st of July 1916, but we're going to be looking at one very famous battle through a very, if you like, under-recognised lens, and that is the story, of course, of the French at the Battle of the Somme. You've been listening to Not So Quiet on the Western Front, a Battle Guide production. If you've enjoyed this podcast, why not check out the Battle Guide YouTube channel, where we regularly release documentaries exploring some of the most famous and extraordinary episodes from throughout military history. If you'd like to support the Battle Guide team to create more content just like this, why not head over to our Patreon, where for the cost of just a cup of coffee, you can get access to full-length virtual battlefield tours, exclusive behind-the-scenes content, decide which subjects we cover in future podcasts and videos, and join a fantastic community of like-minded people. That's all this time. See you again soon. They totally misunderestimate. That's not right. We'd still gained ground. We'd still gained ground.
Human willpower is still a crucial factor in battle.
Was that passed to me? I'm sorry, I missed it.
Nice one, fellas. Excellent.
We've got it down to a fine art now, haven't we?